Studies. And this welcome to our very first event of the fall 2022 quarter. I could not be more excited about this event. I'm sitting next to two of the world's great leading specialists on organized crime, two, you know, titans of scholarship who have both in their own ways, deeply influenced. I wouldn't just say deeply influenced my work, but really opened up research agendas that with which I and many others have followed in recent years. So it's just an enormous pleasure to have both Michelle Mizzi and Diego Gambetta here at University of Chicago this beautiful day for what I hope is going to be a very kind of interesting and open-ended conversation about the similarities and differences in organized crime between Brazil and India. Let me just quickly introduce each of today's speakers and say a little bit about the format and the idea behind this event. So let me start with Michel. Michel Mizzi is a professor of sociology at the Universidade Federal Rio de Janeiro, UFRJ, where he founded the Research Center on Citizenship, Conflict, and Urban Violence, o Núcleo de Estudos de Cidadania Conflito e Violência Urbana, NECVU, Negvu, for those of you who study Brazil or study Rio, Negvu has played a really critical role over the last 15 or 20 years in developing a kind of ecosystem of researchers and scholars on issues of urban violence. Focused in Rio, but eventually spreading out to other parts of Brazil as a whole. And it's really been pioneering in creating that kind of critical mass of scholarship in Latin America. It was my great pleasure this summer to work with Michelle on a joint. Negvu also is the home of Dilemas, which is a Brazilian social science journal, an academic journal, and it was my pleasure to work with Michelle on a joint effort of a special edition of the journal on criminal governance in Latin America in a comparative perspective. If you go to Dilemas' home webpage, you'll see all of the articles were written in Spanish and Portuguese and then translated into English. There's I think 11 articles comparing dynamics of criminal governance throughout Latin America. Felt that was a very successful collaboration also with Fundação Getúlio Vargas, Joana Monteiro, who is our colleague there, who will be coming to Chicago in 2023 in all likelihood as a Tinker visiting fellow. Forgot to say, Michel Misi is here in Chicago this quarter as one of 3 Tinker visiting fellows, and he's also teaching a course for undergrads and graduates called Public Security Violence in Latin America. Just to go back quickly to finish off Michel's bio, he's one of Brazil's most prominent public intellectuals, a leading voice in national discussions and debates concerning crime, violence, policing, public order, public security, and the rule of law. His publications include some of the seminal academic articles on crime and violence in Brazil. And his PhD, which was titled Malandros Marginais e Vagabundos, was extremely influential. It was written in 1999 and is now finally going to be published in 2023, so we're all very happy. Okay, Diego Gambetta is not currently Carlo Alberto Chair at the Fondazione Collegio Carlo Alberto in the University of Turin in Italy. He's also an emeritus fellow at Nuffield College in Oxford. Says that he, in 2012, went on leave from Nuffield. Even before Brexit, knew he kind of wanted out of the UK, I guess, and became chair of social theory at European University Institute, but he remained until going to Turin in 2018. Gambetta has researched challenging topics such as Sicilian mafia and that motivate violent extremists, including suicide attacks. His longer-lasting interest, which still occupies him today, has been the study of trust and trustworthiness, of which he was one of the pioneers. His seminal book, The Sicilian Mafia, talks about endogenous mistrust, right? The need for organized criminal groups to create and reinforce mistrust as a way of maintaining the demand for their protection services. His favorite achievement in social theory, which he realized with the late Michael Bacharach, has been demonstrating how the truster's dilemma of whom to trust can be solved by signaling theory. So, if I may, just make, again, both of these scholars have made huge contributions, but I would just like to highlight one contribution that each has made that I think are really critical for those of you who study these themes. Michel Misi has a theory of what we call mercadoria política, or political merchandise, the shadow markets for political protection that appear when an economic good is made illegal or prohibited. So as soon as you make, say, drugs or other economic activities, prostitution, gambling, illegal, not only does that enhance the profitability of that market, but it creates a shadow market in essentially bribes, influence, political influence, that are necessary in order for this illegal market to function. There's a fundamental insight. And what's more, this market for political merchandise, in Lisa's view, is directly linked to dynamics of urban violence. I think that was a brilliant insight that was deeply influential in my own work. Diego Gambetta also had amongst many intellectual contributions, I think that this notion of protection, really understanding protection also as a market, understanding that there are good and bad forms of protection, and that in places where there's high levels of mistrust and ineffective government enforcement of contracts, including illegal markets, but not only limited to illegal markets, that mafia and other protection rackets can play a positive role. As he says, lubricating economic transactions, a lubricant of economic transactions. I think that was a critical insight, and also helps us distinguish certain kinds of mafia activity from other kinds of organized crime activity, especially those we see in Latin America. I'll leave it at that. Now, let me just say a bit about format. I asked both Professor Misi and Professor Gambetta to open the conversation with an extended presentation in which each would tell us about 3 questions as they relate to their cases that they know best, right? Which for Professor Misi is Rio, then maybe Brazil, and then maybe Latin America. And for Professor Gambetta would be the Sicilian Mafia, and then Italy, and then maybe Europe. So the 3 or 4 questions, depending on how you slice it, that I asked them were, the first topic was criminal governance. Do criminal organizations rule over or provide order in the daily lives of non-criminal citizens? In what kind of areas? Do they charge taxes or protection fees? And the other question related is, do criminal groups rule over or structure criminal markets? Do they regulate the drug market? Do they prohibit certain kinds of crime? Do they manage conflict among smaller criminal groups? The second theme I asked them to discuss was involvement in politics. Do organized crime groups seek and obtain political power? If so, how? Are they involved in electoral politics? What are the benefits they seek from political power? And the third was the use of violence. What are the modal forms of violence that organized crime groups use? Who is it targeted against? What's its underlying logic? I also mentioned a 4th possible topic of sources of income, although that may come up in the discussion of these first 3 topics. Now, I gave both Professor Misi and Professor Gambetta free reign to answer these questions as they like, and so they may or may not address all 3 or to differing degrees, but that was a way of getting us started. So we're going to start with Professor Misi, and then Professor Gambetta, and then we'll have a kind of moderated discussion. I'll ask a few follow-up questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience.
Great. Okay, thanks. I would first like to thank Professor Benjamin Lessing for inviting me to this meeting. It is a pleasure to share this debate with Professor Gil Gambetta, whose work is a reference for all of us. I, in particular, read his book about the Sicilian Mafia when I was studying in Paris in the mid-1990s. I soon fell in reading it an innovative breeze that influenced my studies on the subject. Well, before we get to our subject and already entering, I need to say that I need to start with the Brazilian police and not with the conventional criminals. The Brazilian police is a fundamental variable for a comparative analysis of all police. Okay. It's a fundamental variable for a comparative analysis of our team. It is unthinkable to analyze the criminal organization and armed groups that are active in retail drug trafficking in Brazil without making reference to the way the police act. And not only in Brazil, but in all Latin America. In the first place, the Brazilian police kill a lot. It is the police that kills the most in the world. In the last 10 years, official data indicate that the Brazilian police kill in supposed legal confrontations about 50,000 people, mostly young black men between 16 and 30 years old, resident of slums and poor neighborhoods. In Rio alone, the deaths caused by the police represent, on average, about 25% of all homicides. It is also a police force that, perhaps for this reason, dies more than other police forces in the world, although in proportion 20 or 30 times smaller than its victims. The relationship of the police with the poor young residents of the slums and peripheral neighborhoods is one of the criminal subjections. That is, they do not consider them as holders of rights, and when suspected of crime, they are treated as unreadable subjects, as identities for extermination. The trivialization of the death of criminals in Brazil has no parallel in any other country, not even in other Latin American countries. The violence of criminals toward the police is, in my view, a dependent variable in this way of acting of the police and a node in the process of social accumulation of violence that started in Rio in the middle of the last century and spans until today. Having said this, let us move on to criminal and violent organizations. As our time is short to deal with such a complex subject, I will give more emphasis to the case of Rio, which I have been studying for half a century, but also because Rio tends to be a kind of ideal type of the Brazilian situation and recognized comparative parameter. The first thing to say is the variety of these organizations. Broadly speaking, in Rio, we have three main types of violent criminal groupings that have reproduced themselves all over Brazil. They were born in Rio, in the marvelous city, and they all reproduce today throughout Brazil. The first type is the oldest and the most similar to the mafia type organizations, whose ideal type is the Sicilian mafia studied by Gambetta. It is called in Portuguese Jogo do Bicho, and it's difficult to translate because it's not just an animal lottery or a number game. It's a real, informal, and illegal institution that has existed for more than a century. Curiously, it's a very popular and yet it is the least studied and researched than the other groupings. Perhaps because although it is more public, it's more closed, more secret. The Jogo do Bicho, animal game, has a hierarchical structure of the familist type. About 6 or 8 families control and bankroll the game in Rio. They operate by financing candidates for political posts and different public agents, paying police officers and journalists. It has great influence in popular culture, carnival, samba schools, and salsa. It almost always uses punctual violence, except when there are wars to control inheritance or territorial domination. Since the 70s, the bosses organized a summit to avoid these wars with an elected couple, Castor de Andrade, now deceased. Until then, the bosses were never involved in police repression, which only reached the wards who sold the beds in the streets. We will come back to the Jogo do Bicho later. The second type is popularly called tráfico or movement and is organized by factions. In Rio, there were as many as 4 or 5 factions, and today in Brazil, there are almost 100 factions of local origins and influence, as well as 2 nationally influenced factions, the Comando Vermelho, Civil, Red Common, which emerged in Rio in the 80s during the military dictatorship, and the Primeiro Comando da Capital, PCC, First Command of Capital, which emerged under the influence of the Civil at the end of the 90s in São Paulo. These are organizations that originate inside the Brazilian prison, which are born as protection agencies for prisoners. The latter, divided between two or more competing agencies of this type, gave them the name of factions. Later, these innate organizations turned into profit-making organizations by exploiting and organizing illicit drug retail markets in poor neighborhoods and favelas. Only much later did they launch themselves into controlling the wholesale supply routes for drugs and weapons. Its structure is twofold: internal and external to the prison. The city is divided into territories for the exploitation of the retail trade through points of sale, hence the needs for territorialization. These territories are operated by gang-like formations, with poor young workers organized in a kind of local informal enterprise with different functions: managers, vigilants, soldiers, and salespeople. The boss, called the dono, controls the managers, and it's almost always not seen on site, except when he lives there. When arrested, he operates the control from the prison, making the internal faction loyal to the external one. Meetings of donors arbitrate conflicts within the faction and decide to control other faction territories, initiating armed conflict. Competitions for control of retail territories has led to an arms race since the 80s that has resulted in the consolidation of small arms trafficking, such as AR-15 and AK-47 rifles, grenades, and even aircraft mortars. The homicide rate reached levels never seen before in Brazil. Control over the local population is exercised to avoid resistance and information, with rules of circulation in the area and the law of silence. In compensation, they offer patronage and assistance and forbid robbery and other crimes in their area, on pain of violent punishment, torture, and death. The Comando Vermelho, the Red Command, the main faction to date, occupies the main favelas of Rio de Janeiro and the metropolitan region, imposing itself on a population of millions. Finally, the third type of criminal organization is even more distant from the Italian model because it is operated by groups of police officers, both civilian and military. Initially organized as extermination groups since the 50s, they worked on behalf of small businessmen and entrepreneurs who felt threatened by robbers and kidnappers. With the financial success of drug trafficking factions, these police officers began to produce political merchandise, that is to privatize their condition as public agents, holders of a legal monopoly of the exercise of violence, in order to obtain advantages from drug traffickers and factions. On the one hand, they would make violent incursions into factions' territories, arrest or kill several traffickers, seize weapons and ammunition, and then the following week offer peace to the territory in exchange for financial advantages. They would arrest the manager and negotiate a price for his release. They would sell information about possible new police operations in the area. They would even arrest a faction manager and give him up at a good price for the rival faction to kill him. They would even sell weapons to the traffickers. Finally, they began to parasitize the retail drug market, superimposing an illegal markets for political merchandise over the illegal retail market for illicit drugs. With this, the control of territories by drug trafficking reached its apogee, with various factions competing for police protection. It is important here to make clear that unlike in the case of gambling, police officers in this case gained advantages by negotiating with traffickers. They were never their functionaries or salaried employees. In many cases, the negotiation was imposed under penalty of police invasion of the area, and the protective merchandise, in this case, turned into mere extortion in the form of tax collection. From the end of the 90s on, three novelties appeared, two in Rio and one in São Paulo. For the first time, a judge arrested all the main bosses of animal lottery, and police operations carried out in their houses, treated by the media as fortresses, demonstrate the involvement of police, politicians, and different public agents with them, and the laundering of money in illegal enterprises of different kinds. Lately, after the death under house arrests of the main bosses, we have seen a war between the heirs for the control of the police. The second novelty in Rio was the emergence of para-police or paramilitary groups that began to offer private protection to shopkeepers and residents in exchange for the payment on a fee. Under threat, but also driving away local drug traffickers, these groups, called militias, began to operate and control more and more territories, competing with retail drug factions until they themselves became exploiters of illicit goods such as clandestine public transportation, pirate internet, monopoly control of the sale of natural gas, and lately investment in the low-income housing market. In the last 2 years, they have negotiated agreements with one of the factions and also started to explore drug retailing through it in exchange for protection. The militias now control about 40% of the resident population of the neighborhoods under their armed control. The collection of taxes is often done using the police's own official cars, demonstrating the militia's disinterest in not being confused with the police institution. Many arrests have been made, including of militiamen who held elected public office, but the militias continue to occupy much of the city. The third novel came from São Paulo in the late 90s. Also within the prison system, a faction emerged that sought from the beginning to monopolize control of São Paulo prisons, called the First Commando of the Capital, Primeiro Comando da Capital. It soon differentiated itself from the Red Command by having achieved a degree of organization far superior to the Red Command, both within and outside the prison system. Based on a concept of brotherhood of crime, it established roles, differentiate levels of decision-making, and the use of debates between accused and accusers to define punishment that were not seen as one-sided. It has succeeded so far in ensuring that there is no dissidence, which the Red Command has not, and has thus established effective control as an agents of protection and arbitration of conflicts over the retail drug gangs in the metropolitan region of São Paulo and throughout the state, even line with the Red Command for control of the cocaine and arms routes from the border with Paraguay and the Andean countries to Brazil and Europe and the United States. Ethnographies conducted by researchers in several São Paulo neighborhoods have concluded that the PCC is mainly responsible for the sharp dropping homicide rates in São Paulo, either because of the oligopoly exercised in this market or because of its policy of avoiding homicides in order not to challenge the police and the state. In any case, and in closing, it's evident that the volume of violence of criminal groups and of the police in Rio, in Brazil, and admittedly in Latin America has no parallel in Italian or European organized crime. The factions that are spreading in Brazil today have little influence in the political arena, and the militias in Rio have more local and political influence, and even then, relatively little compared to gambling. The latter, which helped form the first militias, today is torn by conflicts between hers and the falling prestige of his former capos. The ideological base of police and militiamen is predominantly extreme right wing and is not recent but consolidated over decades. The political effects do not result from the fact they are militiamen, but on the contrary, they are militiamen because they share the same ideological base. President Bolsonaro thinks like them and represents what is most conservative in Brazilian society today.
Thank you, Michelle. That was very, very enlightening. Even though I know your work and I know a lot of the things you talk about, I still learn some. I still learn some new things. Just not.
I have much
Yeah.
to demonstrate the territorialization of the factions. It's possible to. Yeah, I need this black cape. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Where is and red is the red command areas
Comando Vermelho.
do Comando Vermelho. Well, and blue are the militias. The PCC
No.
in São Paulo.
Yeah. PCC.
This map is on the Rio. Okay, we have ADA, Amigos de los Amigos, que é a zona pequena, a little faction, and the TCP and green as terceiro comando, third command. Okay.
Just to help explain, so that where you see the color, the coding there, right? You see CV, that's the Comando Vermelho, that's the largest faction, it's the drug
Yeah.
gang, as Michelle explained. TCP is another faction, it's called Terceiro Comando. It's smaller, And ADA is another faction, also smaller. They generally kind of formed by breaking off from the CV. So you can think of them as splinter groups. They have their own histories, but they're generally smaller. The milicias in blue, these are this very different kind of organization that Professor Misi just mentioned, that are police. They have linkages to the police. So it's a different sort of organization. And if you know Rio, this map is telling, because the militias are concentrated in the west zone, which is the kind of that western part of the city, where you see a lot of blue, is a more rural, less densely populated area, and some parts in the north. And then the CV is very strong as you get more towards the downtown. As you look, those of you who know Rio, you can see the Zona Sul, which is the very wealthy part of the city where there's beaches. I don't know, Michelle, can you use the little pode usar
The pointer.
Just to help, as long as we have this map up. This is Copacabana, this is Ipanema, this is São Conrado. These are very well. This is Rocinha. This is a very wealthy part of the city, and these favelas are particularly valuable because that's where there are retail markets where lots of upper middle class people can go to get drugs. This is downtown. This is the north zone. This is the other side of the bay. It's kind of like Oakland, it's San Francisco, and you see that the CV is very strong there as well. This is the Zona Norte, also a very populous region of the city. And then, to be clear, the PCC that Professor Misi was mentioning is an organization that exists in São Paulo. It never made inroads into it. Is it fair? They sort of tried. The PCC came to Rio, and they tried to make a deal with, we're going a little bit further, but the PCC had when they were born, they announced a partnership with the Comando Vermelho. It says in 1993, when the PCC was founded, they had a statute, and they said, in parceria com Comando Vermelho, and so they understood themselves to be allies. And there was this kind of non-aggression pact between them for a long time that eventually fell apart in 2018. And the PCC started having a little bit of a foothold in Rio, together with CV, but also especially with ADA. Who at that time, ADA controlled Rocinha. You may have heard of Nain, this guy, Nemesis. You may have heard of this book by Michi Glenny. And so the PCC had some connection with them, and they wanted to try to pacify Rio and bring their the same kind of peace that they had brought to São Paulo to Rio. And that project failed. And they kind of never made big inroads into Rio, and eventually were sent back to São Paulo. So today they have no presence there. And at the national level, I would just add one last detail. At the national level, the PCC has expanded from São Paulo and has presence throughout Brazil. And the Comando Vermelho, in its own way, has also established presence throughout Brazil. The PCC is more like a giant organization with lots of little chain stores, I guess you might say. And the CV is more like a loose alliance, like a brand, so that local groups can affiliate with the CV at the national level.
Yeah.
But both, if you go to anywhere in Brazil today, you will see both PCC and CV graffiti, in windows. I think that's good.
Yeah, the non-favelas.
The non-favelas?
Yeah, I mean, these guys are only favelas, yeah?
Just one second. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Everywhere is a favela.
Well, that's part of the nature of the geography of Rio. So, yeah, I think that the Zona Sul is a good example. So you saw like some beaches, and then you see some little red right there. Let's take that. That's Rocinha and Vidigal, right? This is Lamy. There's a little red there. Here's another part of
Rocinha has 100,000 inhabitants. Only Rocinha.
Yeah. This little red right here, right? Right next to it is São Conrado. It's one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. here's Leblon, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. So this kind of area that doesn't have a color is very densely populated, high rises, where, you know, a lot of people. And you can see up here too, these, yeah. Yeah, so these are areas where, in fact, you know, I stay in Lemmy, right, at the entrance to Favela, right? And so I live in a high-rise building. Right outside my door, there's a police car that's always there 24 hours a day. And as you go up the street, up into the favela, if you go a little bit further, there's maybe one more police car, and then if you go a little bit further than that, is the Comando Vermelho guys with guns, and it's kind of a frontier. Okay. We have plenty of time to continue this conversation, but I think this gave us a good empirical basis of what's going on in Brazil and the structure of organized crime in Brazil. One last thing I'll say while I get set up. Michel mentioned the jogo do bicho, and that is a difficult thing to translate. So for those of you who don't know Brazil and the case that he's talking about, the jogo do bicho is a kind of numbers racket. It's a kind of illegal gambling thing, but and it's called jogo do bicho. Literally means the animal game because the numbers that you bet on each correspond to an animal, so it has this name, the animal game. But as Michel said, it's a cultural institution. It's been around for over 100 years and had played a very important cultural role in Brazil. And before the drug trade expanded, it was these bankers from the numbers racket who really controlled the favelas before the factions and the Comando. Great. Please, take it away.
Thank you very much, Ben, for your kind introduction. Thank you, Michel, for your very interesting presentation you're talking about. And it's very, as you say, it's difficult to compare the Brazilian case with the Italian case. But it's easier than I thought. On two fronts. One is the number racket, which seems like an odd organization, looks like a stunted mafia, a mafia that didn't expand, but it does. And the other is the PCC. So this looks like a mafia to be. Now I'm telling you, a mafia in the past that is to some extent. But I think on those two fronts there are comparisons. It's more difficult to compare with Comando Vermelho, which looks more like a Neapolitan scale, and with corrupt police. There have been cases of corrupt police in Italy, but nothing on the scale. You describe a giant case of corruption, which you take advantage of your institutional position to gain. So that's a different story. So let me tell you how far back the mafia goes. Between 1791 and 1812, there was an upheaval in the institution in Sicily, which is well studied and has not been studied analytically very much. But the things that changed there resulted in a very special situation, which you can compare with Russia or the Soviet Union in 1989. That's where you can make a comparison. Namely, no private property, all property belonged to the crown. The crown gave property to the barons. All of a sudden, property becomes an institution like we know it, just in a very short space of time. So people were used to a completely different way. So that was shock number one. I can go into detail. I think what happened then is very fascinating. But then, a few years later, we begin to see mafia-like groups and activities recorded in Western Sicily. There is a big difference between East and West. I'll get that in a moment. But you get anecdotal, ethnographic, historical stories of activities of that kind. Then in 1865, the name mafia appears in official document to mean a collective institution organization, right? As we more or less has been used later. In 1861, Italy was born. Modern Italy was born. Unified Austria were defeated. The kingdom of Naples was included in the kingdom of Savoy, and Italy became one nation in 1861. By the 1870s, so 10 years after Italian unification, the mafia is a national problem. Debated in parliament, the object of different reports, and the reason for new laws. In 1898, it is described as a structured confederation for the first time in a prefect report. So everything at the foundation happened before the 20th century. So this is a long story. So this is how old this institution is. Only the Catholic Church is like this. Right, so have a look at, so this gives you a quantitative idea. It's mostly based on Judge Falcone knowledge. So in the 80s, 3,000-4,000 members, subdivided in 105 territorial families, distributed in 142 communities in Western Sicily. Family size between 2 and 200. Nobody knows what these two would be. This is one of the unsolved mysteries. Every few picture. Then
Are they literally families, or that's just a term?
no, it's a term. It's a
They're not literally blood relatives.
no. In fact, no. Thank you for this question. One of the longest idea about the Sicilian mafia is that it's based on blood. It's conveyed by the Godfather and so on, but they do resist the link actively. They don't want brothers to be initiated in the same family. They elect the boss. There is a recording of the top mafia man called Michele Greco in the 70s saying in a telephone call how proud he was that his son was initiated in a different family. I said, this is I mean, when doctors in Italy yes, right? So he was proud. So he didn't, if you make it without a recommendation, you must be really a tough guy. So they live at the market. You see that they live at the margin, unlike anybody else in Italy, right in the middle, and then you find. Now, they form a confederation. This is not known how these leopard distributed families ended up in a confederation. We don't really know. I mean, if you ask me, I will go on to it. So families have the same rules, same initiation ritual, manners of command and interaction. There is a style there as well. And what they share is a judge who understood and deeply said is an intimidation factor. If you can make yourself recognized as a member of this entity, you threaten. And we'll see it in a moment what this means. The number of families is higher and territory is smaller than they are in New York. We have to make a comparison. In New York, there are 5 families, and they are distributed over a wider territories. Now look at this. One of these reports, 3 different police reports on where in which communes the mafia is present. First was recorded in 1974, 1900, 1987. And the biggest thing you see here is that it developed in Western Sicily. There was very little presence in the East. In the East, they expanded later. But say in Catania, here, there still is conflict between the mafia hasn't acquired a complete monopoly. There has been conflict with at least two other organizations. Whereas in this part of the island, the monopoly has been very solid, very stable, broadly speaking, it's exceptionally stable. But and it's only in 1900 they expand eastward. But this is where they are. So these are interesting questions. Why they are not elsewhere? Many they share. There were some differences, but they share also some commonalities that make you predict that they were here as well. Now I can go on your question quickly, so we have more time to discuss. This is a description, this is the kind of standard description of a mafia. He was a man in much demand and sought after by people. He tried to help everybody, to settle personal matters with those who contact him. Then the witnesses say, I don't know what this means to be a mafioso. That's not how we knew. So you ask what they do. So they punish. Here I'm giving you an overview of records that span 150 years. Right? So they mostly post Second World War. But there is record that they've been punishing pedophiles, women harassers. They would be popular these days with making movement, employ these guys, and or adulterers. They have punished fiancé men who broke marriage promises. They have worked against local disturbances. And they obviously have punished thieves that didn't have a license to steal, and they punished people who pretended to be mafiosi and were not. This was my funniest discovery in Sicily. When people have the courage to go, the impotence of showing up and saying that you are a member of the mafia and you're not. And this doesn't go like this. It doesn't definitely. So this is an overview of the many things they cover. Then they do a lot of cartel regulation and trade in these. Some are on legal goods, but most are on illegal goods. But they have agreements that are illegal. Often we don't make the distinction. You make a cartel, and that's not illegal. But maybe you trade in fish and chips on the market, on the street. So there are two sides. But the biggest cartel that they have been enforcing has been in construction, as far as we know. And I can take Then they settle disputes on demand. If you have some trouble, you can show up and say, hey, can you sort this out? I have very noisy neighbors, and so on. It goes down to that level. And
Sorry, is that like a fee basis, or they
yeah,
just do it? Okay.
I was about to say that they charge people who are trading regularly on the street or shops or illegal. Then they may charge a fee. Or they may charge by contract. For instance, they supervise construction contract, public construction contract. And they organize queues. So usually a cartel like this in the world without the mafia gets 6, 7, 8, 10, maximum 12 firms. Usually takes that. These guys organize a queue of 140 gangs. So one at a time, and it's the offer that goes out. And they pay by contract. And as they say, the organized guys, they don't chat for much. Yes, I'm asking you to check. Yes. Never gets close. It's
$5 per contract.
absolutely
$5?
3%
No, I don't.
of the contract.
3%.
3%. Between 3 and 5. So they've been doing this for a long time, and they expanded in the north of Italy on these techniques. You understand that entrepreneurs may have an interest in these queues because they stay in business. They are not eaten by beneficent firms.
These are private construction, not
Yeah,
government projects.
They may be government projects, but they are given to private contractors. Now, what about detecting drugs? You are asking about that. Well, this has been controversial because it's difficult to enforce. You may get cheated at every steps of the way, and if you get cheated, you lose respect, you lose your integration. So much of the old guard was not very favorable, and they're being gone. And then there are also saying, well, but there was so much money, we couldn't hold the people back. And I think that has probably been, I mean, the intuition of the old guard is correct, that they got themselves into trouble. Political power, either involving electoral politics, campaigns, vote turnout, and so what are the benefits they see from political power? Well, the first thing to say is that they are very different positions. Even if in the very few cases in which they are sitting in the same mafia families in which they initiated politician, if you ask anybody, they know who is the holder of the intimidation capital and who is everybody else. So there is a big minestrone in the Italian literature on the relations between politics and mafia. And the minestrone is mostly because they don't make this elementary distinction. But if one of the politicians shows up and says, the Godfather sends me, has one effect. He shows up as himself, it has no effect. This is a massive, but often invisible effect. So,
I'm sorry, can you just clarify? You mean that there are politicians who represent a mafia family? They have an official office, they're office holders, but they come around and they say, I represent this mafia family? Or you're saying,
they represent the whole of it. You know, there were one or two cases. One of the Christian Democrats faction under there were cases of this kind. So people who could go to their own, if they spoke, people speaking to them usually legal, and they were speaking to them. So there was very few cases. And when they couldn't deliver, they were killed. So we just jumped in ahead. So they cooperate regulating cartels. The cartels I described before are very complicated architecture because you have the queue of contractors, the public purse regulated partly by politicians, partly by bureaucrats. So you already have three candidates. And they have to agree, and they have to share, and they have to prepare the bids, and the politician has to keep the right level at which to pitch the offer so we can be sure we will succeed. So it's very detailed affair. And there was a lovely, it's not exactly the word, but case in which a bureaucrat sold the same number twice. It didn't make a happy end. And so this is what they do because they regulate these triplets. They guarantee that every step of the way is ready. And they get between 3 and 5%. And around that, you can find out how they make the money, which is a question, and how, whether they use violence. So this is what I just said. Generally, in election, they side with incumbents because they win. And up to a certain point, probably the 90s, they were able to guarantee that in small communities, people voted as the local godfather said.
No longer.
Well, politics has become very messy, and in the last election, the news is that they stayed out of it. It felt like pure themselves. You know, they asked to have 2 bags of hay in front of his nose. You don't know which one to eat first, and he died of starvation. But this is what happened to them. The problem is that who's going to win? So they supported the social, the Christian Democrat, very little bit the socialists, very, very strong. Now, the cheapest ever to be unpredictable.
So there's no, the current wave of far right, that just won this election, the mafia doesn't feel an affinity towards this kind of far right that's in the sentence.
There's also something else to say, that they've been weakened tremendously after the murder of the judges. The mafia described them as serious. As soon as they raised their head, so the state got very serious. So that's probably also a reason, because they may not be able to offer anything so substantial to the politicians. So they also do the other side. So they become violence against politicians when the state became serious. Then they started killing carabinieri, judges, and politicians. Forms of violence. This is interesting. I mean, first of all, if you want the monopoly of violence, the thing that annoys you most are crazy bastards who go around the neighborhood and do violence for no reason at all. Like emotional or expressive violence that's strictly verboten. You know, almost funny. And they get deterred by threatening them. Then, contrary to much mafia law, violence is used very sparingly. Murder rate in Sicily hardly ever went above 4 every 100,000. But in the United States, it was hovering around 10 over 100,000. And now, is 0.9, one of the lowest in Italy. And the lowest in Europe.
Yeah, Italy is, as a nation, is one of the lowest homicide rates.
Yeah. So in Scotland, it was 3 times as high. So just to, if you across some the stereotypes. And this is a wonderful citation that Valeria dug up for me, which I love. I didn't have it for the book. So since you are asking me how I managed to explain to him that he should not carry out that charge, shouldn't get involved. I must remind you that in those areas I have a name. This means that my invitation, even if expressed in an affable way, sounds like an intimidation. And what I'm describing is like a job for the men of Cosa Nostra, who are friends or acquainted with entrepreneurs. It's something extremely common. So this is the best description of an offer you cannot refuse. Then we use the word affable. And Caltanissetta, by the way, is right in the middle of Western Sicily. Place no one knows, no one goes, very few come after. Moral violence. So they used to punish violation of orders and verdicts. That's the thing that is the most. So if they stipulate that you should reimburse this customer because you cheated him out of his money, or he had a promise from you that you don't do it, then you are against imposters abusing the name, I already told you. Failing at important sensitive tasks, I told you they failed in particular to remove a maximum security sentence, a prison sentence that became legally possible during Falcone, the two main anti-mafia charges. They have used murders against judges and police when threatened, and they use it against each other. There have been a few cases in which they fought. But this is an important point. Before being aimed at people, these threatened symbolically first. So you may receive a very distant symbol, or with collateral symbol, cutting vineyards, burning crops, killing animals, baby and baby. Of course, so they don't go from zero to homicide, which may be unfortunate, but the rate of homicide is significantly.
Can I have a question while we're on this question? So in the internecine wars, it seems like a lot of this violence has to do with coercion, threatening and maintaining a reputation for violence. When you say internecine wars, well, that one, I wonder about that one. Is that like, is there territory, right? Are you invading another family's territory, or is it more, assassinating their leader or something like that, or reestablishing boundaries, or is there actual, we're going to go in and eliminate this other family and take their territory?
Well, I don't think it's never so directly addressing. There is usually a casus belli, some event that starts. For instance, in one village in Western Sicily, in a village called Vicari, the old mafia boss, 80 years old, Marsala was called, was still known as the boss, and people went to him, even though internally they had elected a new guy. But how do you send a signal that there is a new guy and the old guy is out of this? Because the old guy was also good paying, so he wasn't taking people off. People came back from the United States, they went to see the old guy to fix their problems. And so he was killed. So every now and then you see an 80 years old man killed. So it's an unsmooth power transition, of course. In other cases, is a conflict over the share of profits, because these guys, they invest in places where they're good at claiming credit. they put investment into buying trunks or smuggled cigarettes. And each family can put some money. Then when the profit comes, you don't want to be in the position of the accountant, which is one of the most a little tremor of massive. People need to have a mechanism to share. So this is good. So this may unleash. And in that case, maybe certain more pushy families may try to allow underlings of another family to go territory. So it's not you don't get up to they're not no. That's true.
There is violence due to internal conflicts. There is violence due to internal conflicts. When shifts in violence between families, they don't lose territory, but they lose influence. So that in the 1960s, 70s,
But it's not an invasion of somebody else's territory.
that doesn't happen.
No. I mean, probably in the 60s, when there was a boom in construction in Palermo, certain families were gaining more than others. So that generated some which say, hey, you have to share with us, we have the same. So it's about sharing. But it's not that you suddenly get military incorporated. I think there is. This is the. So, in 1992, the Court of Cassation confirmed the sentence to over 400 mafiosi. And that's when Judge Falcone was killed, and that was when, in the 2 years subsequent, so the people sentenced, many of them were sent to a very restrictive security system, so they couldn't see their relatives, they couldn't, they were shit of the money that your enemy see. And they wanted that option removed. That was the big number of them. So when you put 400 of these people in jail, you can't expect them to take this out of them. And there were 2 bombs in 3 cities. And they were signals that they wanted to be removed. They killed one of Andreotti's Andrew, and some people they killed Falcone, they killed Borsellino. Because they knew they had. There's only one boss of that period, and he's still alive. Everybody else is in jail. So, one interesting question for us is how long does it take to make a boss? How do you go from looking like anybody to maybe
If I can I just want to, while we're on this is something that is a common parallel in Brazil. The Brazilian factions, the drug gangs, they have also done not so much bombs, although they've talked about bombs, but they do these attacks where they burn a lot of buses and they kind of have a synchronized attacks on the street. And it's very often to protest where the leaders are being held in prison. It's very often a kind of way to get the government to bring a leader back or to take them out of some system.
But this is the first time that because it's the first time that the government got serious.
Why don't you finish your slide and then we'll have a little bit of time for a visit.
I mean, I have something on 4, but I can stop here. 4 was an option.
With an option.
There is a 5th.
We go to 2, right? Yeah, so since we're kind of closing in on 2, and maybe some people are going to have to leave really shortly, first of all, I want to thank Professor Gambetta for coming. I have a question for both, but I also want to, so I'll ask my question, but I also want to, we'll just try to very quickly do like a lightning round, because we don't have a lot of time, but if people also want to jump in with a question of their own. So let me ask my question, I'll do a quick lightning round of questions from the audience, and then we'll turn it back to Professor Lisi and Gambetta. My question is really, there's a lot here, and we don't have time to talk about all these different things. But I guess for me, one thing that came out from your presentations that strikes me as surprising. In Brazil, the retail drug trade is immensely profitable, and it has transformed organized crime in Brazil. As Michelle mentioned, there was this numbers racket, Jogo de Bicho, that was always there. But the kind of violence that we see in Rio, this kind of militarized violence, this came about with the drug trade. And it came about with the retail drug trade. The very structure of the Comando Vermelho and the PCC, it all revolves around selling drugs at the retail level. So it's very surprising to me that that's not a major story for the market. This is just a very lucrative market. And I wonder how retail drugs are sold in Italy. Who does sell the cocaine? Who does make the money off of marijuana and cocaine? Yeah, right. So why didn't the mafia get involved in that if it was so profitable? And then vice versa, Professor Gambetta told us a story about how the mafia has very successfully inserted itself into the construction business. And this has been a very stable. Yeah, into a host of communities. So it makes me wonder why organized crime in Brazil, or maybe it is involved in these areas, but why has that not been? Why have the factions, for all of, even the PCC, for all of their organizational capacity, they're not very much involved in things like construction. They haven't tapped into government money for sure, as far as I know. So I guess my question is sort of why has, on the one hand, Italian crime not gotten involved in the retail drug market, and why has Brazilian organized crime gotten less involved in these kind of mega construction projects? Let me ask, that's my question. Let's see if there's any in the audience. Okay. I'm gonna have to this is gonna be a lightning round, so try to keep your questions as quickly as short as possible.
Okay. My question is for Professor Lisi. Watching the election in Brazil yesterday, I was struck by how divided the country is between the northeast and the interior. And I know that the roots of the Red Command is in Marxist movements in the 80s in the military dictatorship. So, but they become depoliticized since then. I was talking to some of my friends in Brazil yesterday, and they were saying that if there is a military coup, they're worried about a civil war. I'm wondering, do you think there's a chance that if there is a military coup, the Red Command becomes depoliticized, and that there could be ties between the militia, and then also, are they more concentrated in the northeast and the militia more in the interior of the country? Is that not how it works?
Thank you. My question is for Professor Gambetta. So I was wondering, in your presentation, you focused initially on the origins of the mafia, and then you moved up to 1992, Tony Borsellino, you mentioned the Maxi trial. So I was wondering, can you expand a little bit and elaborate more about the mafia today? You didn't mention, for example, Matteo Messina Denaro and the mafia, right? I couldn't hear maybe.
There was the only boss to that.
Sorry, I couldn't hear from here, so I probably missed some of the information, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the mafia today. And also maybe draw some comparisons with Andrade and Camorra as times allows, because then your reference about the family, the blood ties, is more about the Andrade, so it would be interesting to expand on that.
It's your Professor Lisi. When I saw the map, I noticed that there is the distribution of these groups shows a great degree of separation in some areas. so they control the vast areas, media and economy. But there is a floor in which they all really one next to each other. And they wonder what does it mean in terms of institutional guidance in those states. In theory, one would be inclined to think that where there are many groups, one next to the other, there is no violence. And if that is not the case, it keeps it peace.
Why don't we try to address these questions? That's a lot already, and then if there's time, we'll come back for another. So Michelle, do you want to begin?
Vou tocar em português, and Jefferson will help me.
I'm not a translator, it just speak in a little bit.
O Comando Vermelho, ele não foi tão politizado quanto se imaginava. O que aconteceu é que os presos do Comando Vermelho,
The Comando Vermelho was not as politicized as they were in the past. What happened with that?
os presos do Comando Vermelho foram presos na mesma lei que os guerrilheiros que lutavam contra a ditadura.
The people related to Comando Vermelho, the prisoners, they were in jail at the same time that the people were fighting against the dictatorship in Brazil.
Quando chegou a anistia, a ditadura estava acabando e veio a lei da anistia, os presos políticos foram anistiados, mas os presos do Comando Vermelho não foram, os presos comuns não foram, embora estivessem na mesma, tivessem sido condenados na mesma lei.
Even though they were both under the same law, only the political prisoners were released.
Foram anistiados,
Given them amnesty.
eles, isso provocou uma revolta nos presos comuns. E isso fez com que o Comando Vermelho se sentisse injustiçado.
And this made Comando Vermelho to feel that it was an unfair action.
Alguns dos líderes tinham cultura política, tinham alguma cultura política. Não, nada que se comparasse aos presos políticos.
Some of the leaders had like some political culture, but nothing compared to the political prisoners.
Então, a possibilidade de uma nova ditadura no Brasil, agora, só seria possível com apoio popular.
The chances that we might have a coup now, a military coup, would only be possible with the support of the people, like popular support.
Seria mais ou menos como o modelo do Chaves, na Venezuela, e o Brasil, só que de direita, né?
Basically, it would be the same as it happened in Venezuela with Chavez.
But it would be on the right, not the left.
Não sei se respondi, mas não é essa politização toda que você
It's not all this politicization that we might think.
You want to take one other question?
Yes. First of all, if they have to side with that side, there was the fascist proper still retains some unity to the fact that the real fascists in the 1920s fought against them. So there is no ambiguity there. But two events. A, they killed Bastardo. He was a left-wing agitator. I don't know whether you saw the 100 Steps. It tells the story of it. There's a letter, it's a serious letter. And then they focused on yes, there are strong suspicions that far-right militant committed the homicide of General Dalla Chiesa on behalf of Africa in exchange for probably weapons for his political purposes. So that's just in case. But then also on the drugs, I didn't go on that, but certainly there was a drug that was handled by Sicilian mafia. There was. And, the presence of Buscetta in Brazil. Buscetta was the first mafioso to turn state witness, the man that changed the idea of mafia. May have been that he was a hostage. So he was there to guarantee that deals in which the Brazilian gangs were involved trading with Italian gangs was then more recently, the fact that the mafia was has been semi-destroyed. So in answer to your question, there isn't much to say about the mafia after 1992, except that one boss is still at large and he is very well protected by a circle of people. Those who came were rebranded by the Calabria, which is a different institution, something in common with Bertolo North. And they are, as far as we know, to try
But what about retail trade in Italy? Like, if I go to Palermo and I want to buy some cocaine, is it the mafia that they're selling on the street, or it's local people?
I don't know.
Eu posso ver, então, mas que posso ver, não tem nada a ver
Middle
com
class.
a
Because
Eu
in,
acho que há uma questão importante na comparação, que é uma diferença de estratificação social, sempre todos.
it sounds like there's a key difference in social stratification between Italy and
As facções do Brasil são jovens muito pobres.
the factions. Although they're big, they're made up of young, poor, often black.
Por isso que a única comparação que se pode fazer, alguma coisa parecida com a máfia, seria um jogo linguístico. Aí sim você tem pessoas de classe média alta e até da elite.
Why Michelle thought that thinks that the jogo de bicho is a proper comparison to the mafia, because you actually have upper middle class people in these organizations, often elite members of these organizations.
E isso responde à segunda pergunta, que é exatamente
The violência.
não é a segunda pergunta. É a sua. Por que você tem uma aproximação com o governo da máfia e não tem isso nas facções? Exatamente por isso. Agora,
Okay.
porque eles estão muito afastados da política.
So Michelle's
São
answer
muito
to my
pobres. Agora, os bicheiros tinham muita aproximação com a política e também com a gestão de papéis. Também. Por exemplo, licitações públicas de obras. Entendeu?
So Michelle was saying that. So my question was, why doesn't the factions get more involved in politics, or more involved in these kind of bidding and contracts and so on and so forth? He said it's because they're social background. They're very poor. They're often minorities, and they're very very far away from politics and from the political class. Whereas these older operators of the numbers racket had these kind of connections and actually did get involved in bidding contracts, much like the mafia.
Really?
No mapa, não tem, né?
Não,
So they don't have politics.
eu tenho.
They did have eles tinham território,
Não tenho mapa, mas eu não tenho aqui agora.
mas eles ainda têm território.
Tem territórios. São os territórios do jogo.
Yeah. So the way that the game is, if you go to Rio and you walk around, right, not in the favela, just regular Copacabana, you see on different street corners a guy with a little pad of paper, and he's writing down the bets, the numbers that still exists.
In my research with the o jogo de bicho, eu entrevistei o gerente do jogo de bicho da Zona Norte. E a entrevista foi tão tranquila com ele, que no final ele me convidou a ser gerente também do jogo de bicho.
So he's saying when he was doing his research on this numbers racket game, he interviewed a gerente, which is like a manager, from the north zone of Rio. And the interview went so well that the manager turned to Nisi and said, you know, well, maybe you should be a manager. I can help you become a manager. You'd be good.
Eu queria perguntar para o senhor, se ele se sentiu ameaçado em algum momento fazer pesquisa sobre a Rússia na Itália.
Did you ever feel threatened while you were doing your research in the Philippines? That's right.
So I got somebody who seemed very, you know, I said before, they just have something.
Yeah.
Seemed like that. In fact, I think the later, I said, other people,
Yeah, you're ready to go.
yes.
Yeah. What was the signal? Can you say?
Well, first of all, there was a person, there was a Canadian star who went to Sicily to research from Africa before. But the story was circulating that he had got his scar broken into in his laundry taken. And that his laundry was given back to him a week later, washed and ironed, with a message saying, "Buon viaggio." Saved her. So that's a sign. These are the things that put me on communication. These guys, you think of violence, I think communication is far more interesting.
Yeah.
The second book I wrote was inspired against that. Or by the fact that you can go to somebody and say, "Hi, I'm the mafia." Yeah, you don't. How do you introduce yourself, for example, to the mafia? These are very interesting things. Violence is bad. Full stop.
So violence is just one of many kinds of signals, and it's often a very costly or efficient.
It is, and they try to avoid.
Professor Gambetta is referring to his book Codes of the Underworld, I believe. Incredible book. Also really forward and so.
But then, I think when I got Donald Dad, and got a child until two friends with the babies, and stuff like that. That means this guy, his nose, he should, it was chapter stuff. Then I got a phone call in a place where they ship initially asked me, "Is this the church of La Madonna della Riposo?" And somebody calls you out. See, the private woman asked me if you're at the church of La Madonna della Riposo. So why? I stopped thinking, is this God? So I find out that La Madonna della Riposo means the eternal God.
The eternal repose.
Is the it was a church nearby, and so and also I did get London, this was the one.
Fixed in the telephone fixed it, not a cell phone.
He was a fixed telephone, he was a
Yeah.
So then I was sorry. Then I also got a kind of shadowing campaign. That was really wrong.
I wanted to ask if you had any questions for Michelle.
I have many thoughts.
That Marlene's question was for you. Yeah. You want to answer?
Há constantes guerras entre essas gangues que controlam esses territórios.
So there's constant battles between these gangs to control the territory.
Mas algumas áreas já são consolidadas, foram não há guerra há muito tempo, porque sabe-se que ali não tem como.
But there's a lot of areas where the control is pretty consolidated. And so there's no war because no one's going to try to take over that area.
Há um corredor, uma área lá na cidade, você tem 3 facções e a milícia numa mesma área. E isso já está assim há muito tempo. Não há muita isso.
There's an area of the city, Mare. There's an area called Mare, and you actually see it if you ever visit Rio when you're coming in from the airport. And it's got all 3 factions and the militia, but those, for the most part, it's pretty well consolidated. Even though all the groups are there, every now and then there's some conflict. The place between the Terceiro Comando and the Comando Vermelho they call Baixa da Gaza, the Gaza Strip. You know, and it's true. There's a lot of arms. You see bullets everywhere, and it's a dangerous little corridor. But it also hasn't changed hands, and so it's relatively stable. It's relatively stable control. I wanted to follow up on this question, Michelle, because when we compare Sao Paulo to Rio, Rio's obviously more violent. It's more at war. We see invasions, and especially the militias expanding and everything. But Sao Paulo is also a very extreme case of peace and very low homicide rate, much lower than Chicago. So when I think about Rio, the homicide rate also has come down. So there is a kind of management of conflict, even though there's all these groups. I don't know what you think about that, but I think if you look at, compared to the 90s or early 2000s, the homicide rate in Rio has come down. So it suggests that there's some kind of conflict management, even though there's lots of little wars.
Bom, eu acho que essa redução do homicídio no Rio é relativa, porque as milícias elas escondem.
So you're saying that the reduction in homicide that's happened in Rio is relative or maybe false because the militia groups hide the violence.
E a diminuição de poder das outras facções fez com que também os conflitos entre facções diminuíssem.
And then the factions have lost ground to the militia, so the inter-faction wars have also gotten reduced.
As milícias não ocupam áreas do comando vermelho, elas ocupam áreas que não é de ninguém.
The militias have expanded, but very rarely do they take over an area from the Comando Vermelho. They occupy new areas that don't have any groups.
Agora, em São Paulo, o tráfico em São Paulo sempre foi muito fragmentado. Você não tinha, como no Rio, facções em torno de 5 territórios. Você tinha uma fragmentação muito grande de pontos de venda.
So São Paulo always had a much more fragmented drug trade. It never had this kind of favela-based monopolies, like in community-based monopolies, like in Rio. It had just lots of little dealers. They were very pulverized.
E o PCC ele não controla os pontos de venda como o Comando Vermelho controla. O PCC oferece muito mais proteção do que venda de drogas. Isso é outro ponto.
Yeah, so the PCC has a different strategy. They don't dominate all of the points of sale, the retail points of sale. They might protect lots of retail sellers, or they may sell to retail sellers, at the wholesale level. Yeah. Or they even have as I showed with my co-author, they have a consignment system where they'll give you some drugs and you sell the drugs and then you pay back what you owe. But they're not operating these retail firms the way that the groups in Rio have.
Just what they come up with the mafia draait schade mafia institutions. Really institution in the sense that National Robinson institution. The Camorra is not. It's more of a galaxy of different gangs. And there is a simple test you can make of how stable these things are is to look at the average age of the person. masses. And if you, I looked in the past, and the mafia was 54, 55, so they grow up. In Camorra was 30, 35. So they don't, so they fight, and they under these giants there. If they go to jail and come out of so the interesting question to which we do not have the answer, a solid answer, is how did the Sicilian mafia and the America turn into how did they become confederation? In the 19th century, the places on the map, it took 3 days to go from one place to the other. They were not on the bus. And so how did they do that? What was the mechanism by which they standardized? We have conjectures, but we don't have answers.
That's very interesting. You know, this is a little bit different, but when people write about the PCC, how does it control vast territories and expand from prison? Everybody talks about cell phones. And it's absolutely true that the PCC uses cell phones. They have, you know, if you meet a guy who's a gerente in the PCC, he's spending his whole day writing messages on WhatsApp. That's what they're doing. And they're taking photos. But the Comando Vermelho began this expansion from prison in the 1980s before cell phones. And so what you're saying about them, and so, you know, it's clear cell phones help, makes it easier, but it's clear it's not a necessary condition for this prison-based control over the streets. And so you're saying something similar about the mafia and the Ndrangheta, that whatever, you know, they were able to form these stable institutional relationships at a territorial, at a regional scale, when there wasn't even phones at all.
There is a great movie on the Canadian mafia called Underneath Black Service. If you ever see it, watch it. You see how the mystery of these institutions, even if they expand, they send people to trade around Europe and stuff, the intimidation capital is so rooted in the village where they live. So if they lose the village, they lose the capital. And then in the film, we see the very elderly guy in the village being challenged by one of these young giants, and you will see that. Right? So, gerontocracy,
But we don't have, in Brazil, they haven't been around long enough. You have a few heads from the Comando Vermelho, many also were killed, the first generation were killed. But some of the oldest guys in the Comando Vermelho, maybe 40, 50 years old, maybe. Not saying they maybe 20. But they begin very young. Classic. 40. Jogo do Bicho era mais velho. Next one. Yeah, was it We have the room until 2:30, so we can take another round of questions.
I was just wondering, you talk a lot about how organization political favor from politicians in the state. I was wondering if the other way around, if there's any kind of way that you stay active, stop these organized crime, process or either factions or mafia, and how does the state, again, maybe over Brazil, stop that before they that.
Is there any other way to do another round?
In these favelas where the prisoners are exploiting people and terrorizing them with legislative gang crime, what is the relationship between these mafia leaders and
Eu acho que eu estou colocando a relação entre milícia e comunidade. Isso é diferente da relação das facções com a comunidade.
My question was, is there a parallel between both organizations, and they're radically different in other aspects, and they're located in different parts of the world? Is there any way that one organization may have learned from another? Is there any sort of contact that would allow these parallelisms to emerge other than endogenous?
Organization in Brazil or across?
Across the Atlantic.
Across the Atlantic.
Uh-huh.
From I meant not within Brazil, but across the Atlantic, from the mafia to Brazil or vice versa. And something that drew my attention was that one of the Brazilian organizations is called Amigos, which is another term that's sometimes used for Italian organized crime. So I was wondering if there's some conflict.
I actually have a little bit of a question.
So let's get one more question. Yeah, and that's not going to go. You were talking about the village. And I wonder if you see any change in the legitimacy of the masses with the population of the territories in the past and now. Like the change between generations.
Yes. That is very much so.
You want to work backwards, so you can take that if you want. I also didn't understand how a mafioso. I thought it was very interesting what you said about your power to intimidate comes from your village. But how did that work? If I'm in Rome, who cares about my village back? Why would anyone in Rome care about my village back in Sicily?
Because I have, you see, the difference between gangs that go out of drug dealers is that they were motivated by greed. Mafiosi were motivated by what Sant'Agostino called libido dominante, the pleasure of exercising power. And they are not interested in that. No, they are interested in people, but they are not voracious in that. So, this ability to command men is the essence of the thing. Because it is an order sitting in a, even though they are sitting all in plastic over the sofa. So that can order the murder of people who are anywhere. Why should they do that? Where is this hierarchical force come from? He's afraid of a guy. Afraid of a guy toured Sicily in 1943, informing his pals that the Americans were about to land. And he was just saying, prepara tutti i cosi. Cioè, everything needs to be ready. So, this capacity of command is not being expanded. I don't know about
Yeah. So why don't you want to? Michelle, do you want to answer one of the
The
questions?
first
Yeah.
question,
Can you repeat like just the end of it? How the state
I can translate.
Yeah. How does the state see maybe organized crime and what the state will, not just how the police move on but the other way.
This is actually a question we didn't get to. That's very important. Mas como que o Estado vê o crime organizado? Os tipos diferentes do crime organizado? E o que o Estado faz ou está fazendo para enfrentar ou para não enfrentar? We didn't talk about the role of the state towards the mafia. How does it see it? Does it see it as a threat? Does it see it as a partner? Does it try to help? Does it try to crush them? Does it work? So maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
essa é uma área em que o Estado tem limitações, evidentes.
The state has evident
Tem
limitations.
limitações na Itália e tem muito mais limitações na América Latina.
So it says the state in Italy has its limitations, and in Latin America, the state is much more.
Então, por exemplo, o controle sobre a polícia é Na América Latina, o Estado não tem total controle sobre a polícia.
So Latin American states don't have control, don't have total control.
O controle negociado, controle negociado. O governador, muitas vezes, se sente refém da polícia.
It's a constant negotiation by politicians over their own police. And governors, for example, in Brazil, it's state governors who run the police, not the federal government, not the local government. And state governors often are hostage to their own police forces.
A questão que ela fala é, tantos milicianos quanto os traficantes desejam o apoio da comunidade.
Just the traffickers and the militia both want the support of the community.
Mas isso varia muito de área para área, depende se o traficante é nascido, criado naquela área, ele vai obter mais facilmente legitimidade do que se ele vier de fora.
Depends a lot on a case-by-case basis. Often the traffickers, if a trafficker is from that community, it'll have a lot more support than if a trafficker has invaded and taken over that community and isn't really from the community. In that sense, there's parallels.
Mas, em qualquer caso, é uma legitimidade forçada. Não é uma legitimidade espontânea, autêntica, é uma legitimidade forçada. E nas áreas de milícia, as pessoas reclamam muito, porque fica pagando taxa.
So whatever legitimacy these groups have amongst the local population, it's a forced legitimacy, and residents often complain, especially in militia areas, because in militia areas they have to pay tax. In the areas controlled by the militia, they charge extortion or tax or protection.
But even the ordinary citizens, or just
Yeah. Business owners, mostly. Sometimes residents. Sometimes all residents, and sometimes just business owners. That's because the militia says, we don't deal drugs, so we have to charge you this. Our function as militia is to keep the drug traffickers out, so everyone has to pay us to keep out the drug traffickers. The drug traffickers, I'm generalizing, because everyone does a little bit of everything, but the drug traffickers generally don't charge taxes because they want people to fight them and protect them from the police. The police come in into the drug traffickers' neighborhood and they have shootouts and it's very violent. The militia justify their taxes by saying, we protect you from shootouts. But when they say, we protect you from shootouts, what they mean is, we protect you from the police coming in here. Because the police don't go into militia neighborhoods. Because the militia are the police. So part of what they're protecting people from is the state itself.
Because in fact, the answer to what that's the state. You can't
No, please.
You asked about the state.
Yeah.
You remember, Mrs. Thatcher said there is no such thing as society. Well, you could say there is no such thing as a state. In the sense that it depends on the historical moment, how capable of generating the same hierarchical force of the other ones to people. And this cohesive force usually was used only thanks to the judges that died in the process. Then again, generated a kind of unity between the judiciary, the police, the mayor, the politician, and became very unpopular not to fight that. So that is a state, but it was before, the state before had people that fought and people that fought themselves with power in the state.
What about during Mussolini?
Mussolini, apparently, the history there is pretty because two of the people who studied it thought that the mafia was not. One was James Marsden, and the other was one of his students, Christopher Dye. Very good story. But the end of the idea that mafia was a word of political battle. You know, I say, yeah, mafia is so,
I guess
I mean, by the way, when I started researching in 1996, most of my colleagues thought the market was they thought it was an informal network it was only after Bouchetta, the school, the beginnings of just like God, when the picture that came out, which by the way already exists in the mid-30s, a medical doctor said the same thing. So the matter looked very much like Bouchetta. So during the fascismo, apparently first they fought, then they were segregation. I wouldn't know.
We're gonna have to wrap up, but I wanna just draw out that last, you have the last word,
Eu
Michelle?
tinha essa pergunta sobre se uma organização aprende ou outras.
Oh, yeah, if organizations have learned from one another. Ted, did you wanna?
Aprende sim. Inclusive, uma é dissidência da outra, já tinha pertencido a outra, depois saiu. Então, sim, uma socialização de saberes do mundo do crime.
Yeah, it's clear there's learning. And the cross-Atlantic learning, maybe not so much. But there is a case that the PCC had some Calabrian not mafiosi, but from, I think, Ndrangheta, were in prison with the leaders of the PCC. So there looks like there was some transfer of knowledge there. There's some postcards that got sent to a prison in Sao Paulo from Italy after they've been released. So every now and then you have, and Michelle touched on this, the Comando Vermelho learned a lot from the leftists they were in jail with, the militant leftists. So it's not just between all criminal organizations, it's armed resistance in general, so other modes of learning. So I don't know specifically about, and I don't know about Italy, Italian mafia learning from this, but now the PCC has this partnership with Ndrangheta apparently, so maybe there will be some new learning in that respect. I want to just one last thing I want to draw out before we close is this issue about, Professor Gambetta's response about the state and Michelle Misi's response about the state tell two very different stories. The initial crackdown by Falcone and Borsellino, I always think of Bolsonaro, Borsellino, triggered a very violent reaction by the mafia. It was by far the most violent anti-state, anti-society kind of violence the mafia ever engaged in, assassinating judges, throwing bombs. It backfired. The Italian state, it made the Italian state crystallize its anti-mafia efforts. And ever since then, there's been this very strong state repression of the mafia in Italy. All kinds of anti-state violence in Brazil it has triggered a militarized crackdown by the Brazilian state. The Comando Vermelho first started fighting the state in the 1980s. There's a militarized reaction, but like in Mexico, but it hasn't led to sort of true state capacity. It's very corrupt. There's a lot of killing. There's a lot of violence. A lot of traffickers are being killed, but it isn't actually. It's not like all the chefs are in jail. You wouldn't say it has been like a strong state capacity in this kind of way you're talking about, the judiciary and everyone's on board and there's more honesty and everything. So that is another mystery to be researched and explored. Please join me in thanking. And stay tuned for more class events throughout the quarter. We hope to see